we're sewing Simplicity 8218 View B. Okay, you're gonna wanna make sure that you have a few things when sewing with fluffy or furry type fabric. First thing, lots of pins. For me, it's essential to have a walking foot. And then I'm gonna start off with a medium weight knit needle, but depending how thick the fabric is at the seams in different areas, I might need to switch to a heavy weight knit needle. Okay, let's begin. Okay, the first thing you're gonna do is stay stitch the front of the jacket. So I have piece 1, a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I have my walking foot on, and I'm going to stitch from the notch towards the collar. You're gonna do this to both front pieces. Okay, now you're gonna sew your pockets or get your pockets prepared. It says to press. Now be careful when you're pressing synthetic fabric like this. You're probably gonna wanna use a pressing cloth over this so that it doesn't melt, or iron very quickly or on a lower setting. But it says to press down your 1/4 inch, and then you're gonna sew your seam line all the way around. Okay, so now we're going to sew on the outer edges of the pocket, only on this curved side and the lower side in a 5/8 inch seam, okay? So we have our pocket folded down here. I'm gonna take the pin out, and it's folded. You've got your 1/4 inch, and then you've got it folded on the marking. So you're creating your facing for your pocket. So I'm gonna go ahead and sew this outer edge. Whenever I can, I try to sew with the fur facing down. For me, it's easier for me to get more precise seam lines with the underside of the fabric facing up. Pick my stitching up here. You could pivot at the corner, but with the furry fabric, I just like to pick it up. And I'm gonna start again for the lower edge. Trim my threads. I'm just gonna look at it so you can see where the stitching is. Looks nice and straight and even. You're gonna do that to both pockets. Okay, now we're going to trim about a 1/4 inch away from the seam line and stopping at that 1/4 inch fold right here. So you just basically have a little notch taken out. You're going to turn your facing in. Just make sure that's... Okay, so you're gonna use your point turner and just kind of make sure that the point is nice and pushed in. And then you're going to press the facing down. I'm gonna take my pin out. I'm gonna press my facing down along this whole front pocket piece. So this facing has to be pressed down. When I'm doing that, I'm also going to turn in along my stitching and press this down. And then I'm going to press up for the bottom part of the pocket so that when you're finished, everything would be pressed in. Okay, so everything has been pressed. So I've pressed this facing. This is the top of the pocket, the facing. It's gonna be hard to see where this edge is, so you just kind of have to do your best to kind of feel and pin to give yourself a guide to sew on. So I kind of feel where that is, and then you pin it down. I press the front edge, and should be a slight curve on the front, and then I press the lower bottom in. So then you have this pocket piece here prepared, and this piece is still left raw. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna sew down the facing. And when you're sewing with fur, anything fluffy and furry, it will start to get a little tight to sew. So you just have to kind of maneuver the fabric in. Okay. So just take your time on this part. Okay, so now the next thing we're gonna do, we have our markings on our front piece. We're gonna take our pocket and we're gonna line it up on the markings. Once we have it lined up well, we're gonna pin it down. We're gonna do this to both sides, okay? Okay, so we're gonna sew on the raw edge. And you're gonna sew very close to the outside edge, making sure to keep your pocket on the lining, on your mark, I'm sorry, not lining, on your marking. Okay, so you're gonna do this all the way around, just sew right on the edge. Okay, so I had to oil my walking foot, and I thought I was wiping it down so well, but it still ended up getting some oil and grease on the jacket. So I'm gonna have to put some stain treatment on it. I'm so mad about that. But we're gonna go ahead and finish edge stitching this pocket. And then we're going to do a longer stitch and baste the raw edge. I'm so mad. So you can see I'm gonna have to put some stain treatment on it because the jacket is like a winter white. So ugh. I was wiping and wiping and wiping and it still did that. Okay. Whoops. Your pocket should be on like this. And don't mind the oil. I'm gonna spray some stain treatment on it right now. So you're gonna go ahead and trim your threads and make sure you do the other side. Okay, now we're going to stitch a 5/8 inch seam at the neck edge. We're going to stop at this notch in the center front. So this is piece one, your piece front piece. And I should have done this on the underside. You're gonna stop at the marking, the dot, and you're gonna pivot at that marking. And then continue to the notch. And you're gonna see this stain treatment on my jacket because I need it to sit in as long as possible, and I'm gonna wash the jacket as soon as I'm finished. Okay, so we pivoted at that dot, and now we're gonna stop at the notch in the front. Okay. We're gonna do the other side. Okay, now we're gonna clip to the dot. And it's easier actually if you look on the underside. Okay. Clip to the dot on both pieces. Okay, and then we're going to sew right sides together. You want to line your neck collar pieces up. Okay, make sure everything is the way it should be. Okay, so we're good here. So we're going to find our notches and we're going to pin. And then find our edges. And we're going to pin there. And so we're going to pin this neck collar piece. And we're going to sew it in a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So I went ahead and serged at the edges just to kind of keep the fabric from the fluff from falling off and fraying, and pressed this seam down on the neckline. And so now we're going to move on. Another thing, a lot of times I'll usually use for fluffy fabric like fur fabric, I'll use my needle board for pressing, but you can't use your needle board on this kind of fabric. This fluffy stuff like this, it gets stuck to it and it pulls it, so you don't want to use it on this. All right, so now we're going to go on to the back, and we need to start at the shoulders and then sew in for the neckline in a 1/2 inch seam. You're going to do this to both pieces. Okay, so now in a 5/8 inch seam allowance, we're going to sew the back. It's so thick. And because this is a cheap machine, I have a really nice one, but it's old, so I have to get a new one. But until then, you can still use a cheap machine. Just is a little bit more work, and they're not as strong, so this machine definitely isn't gonna last me. It's already kind of like not hanging on, but it's only $100 and something because I do way too much sewing. But we're looking into investing in a new machine very soon. So if you have a cheap one and you just ran out to Walmart like me and grabbed one, you can still make almost anything. You're just not going to be able to make a lot of things all the time for a long period of time. The machine's not going to be able to hang on. But if you're just starting sewing, this would be a perfect machine for you, just to go out to Walmart and get a cheap $100 and something machine. To do basic beginner sewing like this, you will get a great start. Just gonna check this fabric. Some of the fluff is stuck in there, I think. Okay. There we go. Okay, so I've serged my back seam of my jacket, and now it's time to attach the front of the jacket to the back of the jacket. Right sides together. So, this over. I'm going to lay my back piece here. And I'm looking for some markings because we're gonna need to attach and pivot at some markings or attach at some markings. Okay, so let's look for the front, back. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to find my center seam in my neck and my back. I'm gonna pin that. And I'm going to line up my notches, pin that. And here is where that slit, so we're going to meet that corner dot with the dot, pin that. And then we're going to go down the sleeve, okay? So you see there's this point and there's a dot here. You have markings, so you're gonna put your dot to your dot, and then this part is gonna be open. Now in the directions, it says that you can clip at the neck edge. I like to pin first and then go back and clip where I need the neck edge to kind of widen out. So far it looks okay, like I don't need to do that. But it does help the neck to curve a little bit, so I'll probably clip a little bit. So I'm not gonna do that yet though. So I'm gonna go and start finding my other notch. Where is it? Right here? Yeah. And pin there. And then we're just gonna pin down the whole sleeve. So we're gonna line our sleeves up. We're gonna pin down the whole sleeve and then the whole side of the jacket, okay? Okay, hopefully you had a lot of pins like I advised you in the beginning of this video. So this is what it should look like. You have your neckline and your sleeves pinned and down the side seams. So we're gonna go ahead and you're gonna sew all of your edges in a 5/8 inch seam. So I like to start with one side. So I'm gonna start on this side and then I'm gonna go to this neck edge, tops of the sleeves and the neck, and then I'll finish on this side. Okay, so we're on the neckline now. We did the top portion of the sleeve. So we're approaching that marking, okay? So you can't really see mine that well. But you should have a marking and you've clipped to the dot. So that's where you're gonna stop at, okay? So we're gonna make sure we sew. And then we are going to sew to that corner or that clip that you've marked and clipped. You'll see the little dot. Okay. And then we're gonna pivot. So lift your foot up and you're gonna pivot to keep sewing on the neckline, okay? Now, I did not clip to the curve, clip on the curves because I didn't need to. But if you feel like your neckline is tight, depending on your fabric, then you're just gonna make little cuts and it's gonna make your fabric spread out a little bit and loosen up, okay? And then you're just gonna finish sewing down the arm and then down the side seam. Okay, this is what the jacket should look like so far on the inside. I've serged all of the seams. The neckline is attached. And remember, don't worry about that. That was from our little mishap with oiling our foot in the beginning. So that should come out once we're finished. We'll definitely get this washed. So we've got everything ready for us to attach our neckline facing, our collar facing. So now we're doing the collar facing, and you need to stitch 5/8 inch on the inside edge, just like we did when we were preparing the jacket collar. So we're gonna go in and we're gonna stitch 5/8 inch, and we're gonna pivot at that marking. And again, it's always easier to see the markings and everything when you're working with the underside, the not fluffy side. So I'm approaching that dot. I'm gonna pivot. And we're gonna do the other side the same way. Okay, now you're gonna clip to the curves. I'm sorry, clip to the dot. So you're gonna clip just like you did on the other part of your jacket. So clip both pieces to the dot. Okay, now we're going to stitch the back neck piece. So you're going to put both pieces together, right sides together. We're gonna pin it, and we're gonna stitch in a 5/8 inch seam. All right. I'm excited. I'm so excited for this jacket because I've been seeing these teddy bear jackets all over the internet, Pinterest. They look so soft and comfy. Now I'm gonna have one. Okay, so now I'm going to serge the seams, the edges of the seams to neaten it up, and I'm gonna press this down. I'm also going to follow the instructions, and I'm going to fold this up where we've done the clipping, this neckline, and I'm gonna press this down, okay? Then we'll be back. Okay, I went ahead, and this is the neckline. I went ahead and pressed down that 5/8 inch, finished the edges of my seams and pressed them open. I also finished the edges of the top of the shoulder piece. These areas will be tacked on onto the shoulder. And the inside of the facing, it was left raw in the instructions. You don't have to do this, but I finished off those edges as well. Okay, so now we are going to switch our machine to a long stitch. And I'm going to do it this way. In the directions, it just has one long straight seam, but I'm gonna start on one side at the notches here, and I'm going to stitch approximately 5/8 inch away, so a 5/8 inch seam line, maybe slightly in a little bit less. But I'm gonna do a long stitch, and I'm gonna stop at the center back, okay? That's what I do because it makes it easier to pull the threads out. Some people don't remove the threads, that's fine as well, but I'm just sharing with you how I do it. So you're gonna do a long machine stitch to this whole curved side of your facing. Okay, I'm gonna stop there, and I'm gonna go on and do the other side. We're basically doing basting or like a gathering stitch because we're gonna have to actually gather slightly to curve the collar into the jacket because it has a curved seam. Okay, so I'm gonna go place it back at that center marking. And now I'm doing the other side. And then I'm gonna go back in, and I'm gonna do a 1/4 inch. So slightly inside the edge of the fabric. Starting again at the notches on the other side. I'm gonna come in and I'm gonna do another row of long stitches. Okay, so I just wanted to show you the collar. I have pinned down the facing. Remember, we finished this edge. So you have your curved edge here. I actually took out the basting stitch or the gathering stitches because I found I didn't need it and it just made it a little too tight. Because of my fabric, I was able to get the curves in nice. So I eased them in very nice. So you have your curved edge here. Here is the back. This is how your neckline should look. You have your facing folded under on that 5/8 inch. Make sure that your seams and everything line up on the top and the bottom. Your shoulder pieces will be here. So everything is pinned nicely, okay? So make sure you do that, and you're gonna sew this whole pinned edge in a 5/8 inch seam, okay? Now, the thing you have to be careful of is you're going to stop here, 1.5 inch above the edge. So this is 1.5 inch above. So when you sew this, sew, stop here, pivot, and then sew straight across to the end here, okay? So I'm going to measure out 1.5. Okay. I want to check and make sure that my edges of my jacket are at 1.5. So where is it? On the underside, it's much easier. So I'm 1.5 there. Just want to make sure everything is even. And 1.5 there, perfect. Okay, so now at this point we have to stitch across, right? So we want everything to be nice and straight, 1.5, so everything even. So I'm gonna mark 1.5 because that's where we're gonna sew, right? And also we're gonna have to fold under 1.5 on this lower edge. So I'm just gonna mark 1.5 all the way across. Okay, so we've marked, now we're gonna go ahead and sew across the bottoms. So I'm gonna start with this side, I guess. And the blue you see is gonna disappear and wash out. The other blue is the stain spray that I use, the gel, OxyClean gel, for that oil that was from oiling my foot at the beginning of the video. So I'm praying and hoping that it comes out. Okay. Okay, so we're gonna start at the edge. Make sure everything is nice and flat. Your marking, remember you've marked to 1.5 inch for this seam. You're gonna come straight across. Okay, you're gonna do this to the other side as well. Okay, so now we're going to trim and we're going to stop right before the seam. So the edge of the fabric here. So I'm gonna go in and I'm gonna go in about 5/8 inch away, and hope you can see what I'm doing. I'm gonna stop right here. Okay, so this is what it should look like. You have this fabric here. It's all these little fuzzies. Still extending maybe 1/4 of an inch, and you've taken all the rest of this off. I'm going to cut on my corner. Now I'm going to use my pinking shears, and I'm going to trim all the way around the edge. So I'm going to take my pinking shears, and this is kind of thick fabric, so it's going to take you a little bit of time. Not a lot, but you know, you're going to have to take time to do it because it's thick. But I'm going to go all the way around my edge like this, okay? Okay, so I have pinned my collar down. We're on the home stretch, guys. Okay, so you want to make sure everything is, seams are even. And I didn't press mine open, so you're just going to press yours to one side if you did it like me, a narrow kind of a seam, I'm sorry. So I've pinned down my neckline along the collar, the front, and then I have pinned down my sleeves along the 5/8 inch marking. So I pinned down my sleeves. So we're going to tack those, or sew those down actually according to the directions. We're going to sew this down, both sides, the shoulder. Now, it had us do the 1/2 inch hem at the bottom. Do you remember that? So in the beginning. But what happened is, as I pinned this, I realized 1.5 inch is too high. So what would have happened? The 1.5 inch would have left the fabric here. This is our pocket. So we can't have a seam, a stitch going across the lower portion of our pocket. So what you're gonna have to do is you're gonna fold up on your markings, that 1.5 inch, but you're gonna make a narrower seam, a narrower seam. So you're gonna fold up that 1.5 inch, but then tuck in or fold in that portion that's too high. That way, your seam actually runs along the bottom seam of the pocket, okay? So here is an example I'll show you. I'll try to do it with one hand. So I've marked my 1.5 inch, right? So you actually would have had to do this. That would have been your seam and your bottom hem, and your stitch would have went across the pocket. That's too much. So I'm gonna do that, but I'm gonna tuck under to meet that marking, and then I'm gonna pin. So when I stitch, the stitch is gonna fall right on the lower portion of the pocket. That is an error with the pattern. That's not anything we did. And then the only thing we would have left to do is the hem on our sleeves. So we're in the home stretch. Okay, so I measured from the bottom towards where the pocket seam was, and it's 1 inch approximately. So I'm going to stitch all the way across in a 1 inch seam, and I want to make sure that I'm catching in the edge of this fold here, okay? So we want to make sure we catch everything in and everything's nice and smooth. So we're going to do that all the way across to the end. Now we're going to go ahead and do the neckline and the shoulder, okay? So I'm going to start with the shoulder. I'm just going to pull this in. Now the jacket should be really thick and fluffy, and I'm just loving it already. I cannot wait until I throw it in the wash and fluff it all up and get a chance to wear it. So I'll show you guys the finished jacket in just a second. All right, so we're gonna find the shoulder, and the directions say to sew it down. So a lot of times when you're doing a neckline and shoulders, it'll just say to tack it down and tack or slip stitch the neckline and tack the shoulders, but the directions actually say to sew it down, so that's what we're gonna do, okay? And the fabric is very fluffy, so I think that's what they expected you to do, and it hides the stitch well, so. All right, so you do not wanna move your fabric at all from where it's pinned. because it should be pinned right on that seam line of the shoulder. So I'm gonna follow my 5/8 inch seam line that I already put in, and I'm gonna take it right to this corner, okay? So hopefully you can see. Move the machine a little bit. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and do this now. I'm keeping the fabric nice and still on that placement line. Okay, so we're gonna pivot. And we've got this last shoulder piece here, and you should have a 5/8 inch stitching line, and you're just gonna follow that line. Nope, take the pin out. Okay, so we have turned in, I finished the edge of my raw edge of my sleeves off with the serger. I marked a 1.5 or 1.25, I think it was 1.5 inch hem allowance, and I folded it in, and now I'm going to stitch. You want to be careful that you're not sewing down your under part of your sleeve too, so make sure it's, check it as you're turning it.